So this talk is about greenwashing with a particular focus on North London and heat networks and how it affects council tax, how it affects pollution and how it affects the planet. Now, I'm a member of the Haringey Climate Forum steering group, but I have to say this research and conclusions are my own. We haven't had any kind of, vote on, yes, this is our policy. Right, okay, so the next one I'm having, where's the, right. Can we all see this okay?
Yeah.
So a very good example of carbon accounting, which is used in greenwashing, is the Edmonton incinerator. Now, I'm going to go through some sums here, so sorry for people that don't like sums, but this is really quite important. Did you know that the Edmonton incinerator will add 700,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide every year into the atmosphere? But the North London Waste Authority says it's only going to admit 28,000 tonnes and therefore it's low carbon. How come we've got such a difference? Now that 700,000 tonnes, bear with me please, it's 381,500 for burning green waste, which is the food waste that you put in your black bags and garden waste. And then the rest of it is fossil fuel waste, plastic, textiles, etc. 318,500, that comes to 700,000. So the big issue is that then the North London Waste Authority, when it is accepting calculations, it ignores the 381,500 tonnes. And the reason for that is because burning of the biogenic stuff, such as food and trees, is the subject of an IPCC dispute, and their advice is that you can ignore it. Now, I've put a little panel at the bottom, which I'm hoping will explain this a little bit more. But the IPCC had to decide where to account for different kinds of emissions. And for biogenic matter being burnt, they had the choice of either the emissions from the energy when it was burnt or zero emissions if they said that those emissions were counted in the LLUF, I can't remember what it stands for, is to do with tree growing. That assumed that they could count it as zero emissions because if you throw away a tomato, another one is going to be grown. If you cut down a tree, another one is going to be grown. And if you didn't cut down trees or harvest tomatoes, there would be rotting matter and that would be giving off carbon. So they came down on saying, we're not counting the carbon emissions from burning waste in the energy sector. I'll say more later on about what the implications of that are. What we could do actually with all of this waste, you probably know this, is take it out of the black bags and put it into anaerobic digesters. Now they break down organic waste in the absence of oxygen and they produce green gas that can be used as gas and residue without the methane that would be given off if you just put it in the ground. So anaerobic digesters really should be a solution to the problem, but there's no money in them, there's not enough of them, and they're just being ignored. So moving on to the next deduction, which is to do with electricity. They then, of the 318,500, they take away 196,700, saying that, well, we're producing electricity, and if we didn't produce that electricity, you'd be using it from the grid, and that would be using coal or gas to generate it. Now, you obviously know that that's not really the case anymore, and that's really out of date. We've got a lot of wind and solar. It disregards that, and it decides that that is the case moving forward for the life of the incinerator and assuming that we won't even be decarbonising more. So that 196,700 is really not a good figure. Now, moving on, and I'll be saying quite a bit more about this heat, even though it's a smaller figure, 65,800 tonnes, they're saying, and we're going to be heating homes. If we weren't heating homes through heat networks, using the heat from the incinerator, all of the people in the new estates that will be getting it, and some of the existing estates that the moment have got heat networks but use gas, they would be using their own gas boilers. And that's very high carbon. So we can say that we're saving 65,800. Now, I will mention that that is not recommended by build professionals who understand how to do zero carbon buildings, but that is the case for heat networks at the moment. So I'm going to slip out of the figures for a minute and say what is a heat network, and where are the costs of that. Now, at the moment, in Enfield and Haringey, we have got networks that use gas. My own block of flats has got a big gas boiler in the basement, and it sends it around to 65 flats. Now, some council estates have got gas boilers that do this. So the idea is, well, we're going to replace that with heat from the incinerator. So then, of course, you've got to do this big pipe from the incinerator to the estates. And it's common sense that that's going to cost millions of pounds, which you didn't have when you had a little heat network in an estate. But just in case, they will be keeping the gas in all of these energy centres for backup. So that's a concern. So getting back to the sums, the last thing that the NLWA will take off is 28,000 tonnes of CO2, because they retrieve metal from the ashes in the incinerator. And if that metal was new metal, then that would incur emissions. So they say they're saving 28,000 tonnes. Well, actually, if they'd taken that out of the black bags in the first place, they would have actually got more metal. So that's not terribly good. Now, I'll just say that Vicky Pite and I worked on this poster in February, which sums it all up. Now, it's rather busy, but the message is, you know, why are we emitting 700,000 tonnes of CO2 from the incinerator? And yet it is claimed that it's only 28,000 tonnes. So I'm going to move on then as to which to be believed. You know, does it matter what is believed? So in the case of the Enfield and Haringey district heat networks, the decision makers in the government and local authorities have to think about where to get heat from. And they have this message ingrained in them: we have to get rid of tons of waste, so it must be good to use the heat from burning it for district heat networks. Now, that just sounds like common sense. I believed that for a very long time. But that advice is based on that 28,000 tonnes I just showed you, which I will say is not helpful, because actually 700,000 tonnes goes up. They're also assuming that the alternative would be to put it into landfill, and that would produce methane if they hadn't taken out the biogenics. That the alternatives would be traditional gas boilers, that heat pumps require electricity, and that would be fossil fuel electricity, and that we won't be decarbonising, and that the waste legislation in the Environment Bill that would reduce the waste won't happen. It's also assuming that the government's going to pay for carbon capture and storage for the North London incinerator. Now, I find that a little bit tricky to understand, that one, because we've many reasons for believing that they won't be paying for that, and maybe we will if there is carbon capture and storage. But the claims on carbon capture and storage are, though we've only got 28,000 tonnes of carbon, we're going to store 700,000 tonnes of carbon. So that's negative emission, and we're going to be paid for that as a whole business, industry and financial sector, based on this negative emissions of, we didn't have it in the first place, but now we're burying it, then it's valuable. So on the other hand, what the decision makers could be considering, should be considering probably, is, will the heat for the new builds and updating the district heat networks be the lowest carbon? To me, that's the most important one, but it's also very important. Will it be the lowest cost to taxpayers and council taxpayers? Will it include cooling for these homes as we get hotter and hotter? Because the new technology will allow for cooling equally in the summer, and using solar panels, you know, that's when you want the cooling. Will the promised legislation to reduce waste volumes actually happen? Because if it does, they won't have enough feedstock for the heat supply. And will they then just have to go back to the gas? Will the solution depend on paying for the heat network and carbon capture and storage when that money could actually be used for new renewables? So, you know, I've got a question here. If they don't consider that, why not? And I'd like us to explore that later when we get to the discussion. So I've made a bit of a balance sheet here on who to believe. There's the North London Waste Authority based on the IPCC that says only fossil CO2 should be included, though they've got a bit as well that's rarely mentioned that says the approach of not including biogenic emissions in the energy sector total, which we do, should not be interpreted as a conclusion about sustainability or carbon neutrality. North London Waste also relies on DEFRA that says 373 grams of CO2 per kilowatt are avoided by using incineration instead of electricity from gas. That was based on 2013 figures. They weren't comparing it with wind or solar or tidal or anything like that. But DEFRA also have got this statement: the atmosphere cannot distinguish between CO2 released from a biogenic source versus a fossil source. But they still go along with, you must not count that, you must say that that doesn't exist. Now, because of all of this, BEIS have just come out with this heat network infrastructure programme, and their announcement is nearly 28,000 homes and businesses will be shielded from costly fossil fuels as the government awards £54 million to 4 heat network projects in England. And I'll be saying more about those in a minute because they are where we are. On the other hand, people could believe the work of the build professionals and carbon accountants, such as Chris Twin of the London Energy Transformation Initiative. They have a decision tree for choosing heat. And he's also the author of Heat Autonomy, Life After District Heating en Route to Zero Carbon. And LETI is made up of build professionals, architects, surveyors, engineers. They all actually understand the industry and what can be done. There's also Dominic Hogg, who was the founder of Respected Consultancy. He's the author of A Burning Issue and Eligibility of Incineration for Green Bonds, because at one time the incinerator was being touted as, oh, lend us money, this is a green, for a green bond because this is low carbon, and he was up in arms about that. The other body is London councils. They have a paper called Retrofit London, which says energy from waste is one of the highest carbon forms of electricity generation, and that new heat networks should not use fossil fuels. I did a freedom of information on them recently to say, is that still their policy? And they came back saying, oh, we can't tell the boroughs what to do. So though they have published this paper, it's obviously not got any teeth. So there's two choices here. I believe the North London Waste Authority. Now, I've made a quick table of all of the projects that the government is giving out the money for. And they say how much capital each one will be, how much they're giving in grant, how much they're giving in loan. And the Meridian Water extension to Meridian, Tottenham and Wood Green, the capital cost of those long pipes I just showed you, £150 million. And London Energy, which is owned by the North London Waste Authority, will be selling heat to Energetic, which I'm sure you know is owned by Enfield, to sell to residents. So that means there's £29 million of grants from the government to do those heat pipes. Who's paying for the other 120 million? So that's a question it would be good to explore. And who benefits from them using the incinerated waste compared to the other technical solutions? So going on to the other technical solutions, the Chris Twin and his heat autonomy paper, I've got a little diagram here, which is beyond my technical ability, I have to say. They recommend a 2-stage mechanical ventilation heat recovery operating in heat autonomy, which basically says almost passive house standard of envelope for new builds. So they don't need a lot of heat, and then use all the heat that's in the house to go back on itself. As I said, they've got a lot of research on that. It's in the paper. It looks like the answer to most circumstances, and that they should be consulted. And they also, in that paper, on the effect of residence bills, at 14.5p a kilowatt, it would be £285 to heat a 3-bedroom apartment, compared to 377 if they had a district heating system. Now, I've just had an update from my company, and I think it's like 35p a kilowatt or something we're paying now. But, relatively speaking, those sums stand up. Would be cheaper just to have a good quality home. And as for the taxpayers, if each place was built with its own heating system, we wouldn't need those pipes. Well, that saves 150 million, or 120 if the government's giving you some. So that really comes to the end of my talk. And I'm hoping that later on we'll really have a good discussion on why do government and councils rely on the advice they get without consulting other people who are knowledgeable. And that will be an interesting discussion. I haven't really said a lot about air pollution, but a similar thing applies, that who do they choose to ask about that? And how do the choice of advisors affect commitments from UK and council taxes? So thank you very much for listening, everyone. I hope that's been informative and helps a good discussion.